If you value truth, honor, and the principles this country was built on, this story is for you. Today, we walk into a courtroom where the Constitution is put to the test, and one young American refuses to back down. This isn't about politics. It's about the rule of law, the power of resilience, and what happens when someone challenges the system and wins with dignity. Stay with us, because justice is still worth fighting for. Judge Samuel Whitmore sat alone in his chambers high above the streets of Chicago, the morning light slanting through Venetian blinds, casting long shadows across his mahogany desk. On the muted TV in the corner, a viral clip played again. Karoline Leavitt standing in court, calm but defiant, holding up her phone and declaring, "I have the right to defend myself, even from you." The gavel slammed in the footage, but it wasn't her who flinched. It was him. He reached for the remote and paused it. Her eyes, sharp, unwavering, froze on the screen. He had underestimated her. The moment he mocked her law degree, the moment he interrupted her defense and fined her for contempt, he thought he was maintaining control. Instead, he ignited a national firestorm. His own words, recorded and played back before the entire courtroom, exposed a truth he hadn't admitted, even to himself. He'd brought bias into his courtroom, and now the media was circling. Headlines from both left and right lit up his phone. Judge humiliated in courtroom showdown. Free speech versus The View. A legal earthquake. Whitmore leaned back, suddenly feeling the weight of 30 years on the bench. For all his credentials and convictions, it had taken one moment, one offhanded insult to a young woman in a navy suit, for everything to crack. Outside his window, the courthouse plaza buzzed with reporters. Inside, silence. And the knowledge that the next chapter of this story would not be his to write, it belonged to her now, Karoline Leavitt, and all he could do was watch. It began with a single sentence, sharp, measured, and delivered without a tremble. Standing at the White House podium beneath the glare of reporters' flashes, Karoline Leavitt looked directly into the cameras and said, "Extremist daytime television shows have no place receiving federal funding." She didn't name names. She didn't need to. The room stilled, then erupted in questions. One reporter shouted, "Are you referring to The View, Miss Leavitt?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Within hours, the clip was everywhere. News sites, talk radio, late-night TV. Some called her bold. Others called her reckless. But the message was unmistakable. Karoline Leavitt, at just 27 years old, had taken a direct swipe at the cultural establishment. On The View, Whoopi Goldberg responded the next morning, visibly shaken. "This is a personal attack," she said, her voice taut with emotion. "It's not just about a show, it's about silencing voices like mine." The audience applauded, but the damage had already begun. Advertisers pulled out. Social media buzzed with outrage. Commentators on both sides dissected every word, turning a policy opinion into a culture war battleground. In the West Wing, the reaction was mixed. Some aides praised Karoline's clarity, her refusal to pander. Others warned she had gone too far. But Karoline stood firm. To her, it wasn't about Whoopi or even The View. It was about the principle that taxpayer dollars shouldn't fund political commentary under the guise of daytime television. Still, the backlash swelled. 3 days after the press briefing, a formal lawsuit arrived, Goldberg v. Leavitt, $10 million, 0 cents for defamation and reputational harm. Most press secretaries would have resigned, most would have settled. Karoline did neither. She issued a short statement, "I stand by what I said and I will defend it in court." That sentence, too, was clipped and replayed across America. And just like that, a White House remark meant for a policy discussion became the match that lit a national fire. For millions watching, it wasn't just about a lawsuit, it was a referendum on truth, media power, and whether one woman could stand against the full weight of the celebrity machine. And for Karoline Leavitt, it was just the beginning. The envelope arrived not with a bang but a thud, thick, official, and cold. Karoline Leavitt sliced it open at her White House desk, already suspecting its contents. Inside, a formal complaint filed in federal court. Plaintiff Karen Elaine Johnson, professionally known as Whoopi Goldberg. Allegation, defamation, reputational harm, and damages totaling $10 million, 0 cents. For a moment, Karoline sat still, fingers tightening around the pages. She knew this was coming, but seeing it in black and white made it real. Her words at the briefing, intended as a critique of government spending, had been recast as a personal attack. Her intent had never been to target Whoopi directly, but in a media landscape hungry for conflict, nuance had no currency. Within hours, the press swarmed. White House press secretaries sued by TV icon, Goldberg v. Leavitt, free speech or slander. The headlines ran red hot. CNN analysts debated malice, while conservative talk shows hailed Karoline as a defender of truth. In the White House, reaction was split. One advisor urged her to apologize. Another floated the idea of a leave of absence. Even the chief of staff hinted that perhaps backing down might be the smarter play. But Karoline had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to run from a courtroom just because her opponent was famous. "This isn't about feelings," she told a press pool the next morning. "It's about law." With those few words, she drew her line in the sand. Whoopi's legal team, led by Hollywood favorite attorney Miles Broderick, pounced. He called the lawsuit a necessary stand against reckless speech from those in power. Behind closed doors, he warned that this wouldn't be a trial, it would be a spectacle. And indeed, it became one. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse. Hashtags like "Stand with Whoopi" and "Leavitt v. Hollywood" trended overnight. Opinion pieces flooded the internet. But inside the storm, Karoline remained still. She requested no outside counsel. She would defend herself. Some called her naive, others called her arrogant, but those who had watched her closely knew better. Karoline Leavitt was preparing not just for a legal battle, but for a defining moment. A case that would pit cultural power against constitutional principle, one that would test the limits of the First Amendment. And in a country divided by media, politics, and ideology, it was clear. This wouldn't just be a lawsuit, it would be a war of worlds. And the courtroom in Chicago was about to become the front line. The morning air in downtown Chicago was crisp, the kind that made breath visible and nerves sharper. Outside the Everett M. Dirksen Federal Courthouse, reporters crowded behind metal barricades, cameras poised like sentries waiting for a signal. When Karoline Leavitt stepped out of the black SUV, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit and heels clicking against the concrete, the chatter surged. Flashbulbs ignited. A journalist shouted, "Miss Leavitt, are you confident going in alone?" She didn't respond. Her face was calm, calculated, almost serene, but her jaw was tight. Inside the towering courthouse, built like a fortress of steel and stone, she moved past security and into the echoing chambers of courtroom 4B, where the fate of her reputation, and perhaps the First Amendment, would be decided. Seated already at the plaintiff's table was Whoopi Goldberg, striking in black with dark glasses and an entourage of legal aides. Beside her, Miles Broderick, the silver-tongued celebrity attorney known for turning courtrooms into theater, reviewed notes with a casual arrogance. As Karoline set down her briefcase, she could feel eyes on her, not just from the benches behind, where reporters and activists had packed in, but from the man on the elevated bench, Judge Samuel Whitmore. Whitmore was a Chicago institution. 63, silver-haired and known as a stalwart of progressive rulings. His reputation for being harsh on conservatives had earned him both praise and notoriety. Karoline had read the records. She knew what she was walking into. Still, when he adjusted his glasses and peered down at her over the rim, she returned his gaze with steady defiance. The court bailiff called the room to order. "All rise." The audience stood as Whitmore entered fully. He looked at Karoline for a long moment, then cleared his throat and spoke. "We're here to hear Goldberg v. Leavitt. Plaintiff, proceed." His tone was clipped, cold, not even a nod to Karoline's presence. Broderick rose like a stage actor hitting his mark. "Your Honor, the plaintiff is prepared to prove substantial damage inflicted by a reckless public servant whose words were targeted, personal, and meant to wound." The crowd leaned forward. Karoline's heart pounded, but her expression didn't waver. As Broderick continued, presenting the first stack of documents and projecting a financial loss chart on the courtroom screen, Karoline silently opened her file, the thick stack of evidence she didn't have a team of paralegals or a fleet of assistants. She had transcripts, data, case law, and her conviction. This wasn't going to be a fair fight, not in the traditional sense. The courtroom, the media, the culture, it was all tilted. But for Karoline, that was exactly the point. And as she sat there under the unflinching gaze of a judge who had already decided what she was, she knew one thing for certain. She'd have to fight for every inch, and that fight was about to begin. From the moment Karoline Leavitt rose to speak, it was clear the courtroom wasn't neutral ground. As she stood behind the defense table, hands steady on the wood, she introduced herself formally and stated her intent to self-repress. Judge Samuel Whitmore's reaction was immediate, a condescending arch of the brow followed by a dry, cutting remark. "Very well. Let's hope this isn't just a press performance, Miss Leavitt." The comment drew a chuckle from a few spectators in the gallery. Undeterred, Karoline pressed on, citing her credentials, a law degree from Yale, years of work in legal policy, and her role as White House press secretary. But each time she attempted to lay out her defense, she was interrupted. When she referenced the First Amendment and New York Times v. Sullivan, Whitmore waved it off. "We're not here for a law school lecture," he snapped. "Stick to the matter at hand." His disdain wasn't subtle, it was front and center. Karoline tried to introduce the transcript from the original press briefing as evidence, a carefully documented file showing she never named Whoopi Goldberg nor The View, but the judge stopped her again. "Documents can be submitted later. Don't waste my courtroom's time," he said, rapping his gavel. The message was clear. This courtroom under Whitmore was not a platform for her defense, it was a gauntlet. Then came the escalation. After a third interruption, Karoline calmly requested the court to consider her filing in full context. Judge Whitmore responded not with curiosity, but with contempt. "You're bordering on disrespect, Miss Leavitt. One more misstep and I'll hold you in contempt." And he did. Before she could finish her sentence, he fined her $1,000 0 cents for what he called grandstanding. Gasps filled the room. Reporters scribbled furiously. On social media, the moment was clipped and shared instantly. "Judge smacks down Leavitt in court." But Karoline remained still, her hands never leaving the table, her jaw tight but unshaken. She took the fine without flinching. Not because she agreed, but because she understood what was unfolding. This wasn't just legal opposition, it was institutional resistance. She was a young woman in a powerful role, daring to defend herself against celebrity and legacy in a courtroom that was, from the start, built to favor the other side. Still, she didn't blink. The harder they leaned, the stronger she stood. And as Whitmore moved on, confident in his control, Karoline quietly opened the next tab in her binder. She wasn't done. Not even close. The courtroom shifted as Whoopi Goldberg took the stand, her presence alone drawing the eyes of everyone in the room. Dressed in a sleek black coat over a tailored ensemble, she exuded control, but there was a tension beneath it, a subtle strain in her expression as she adjusted the microphone. Miles Broderick, her attorney, approached with the precision of a showman, asking the opening question with practiced warmth. "Miss Goldberg, can you describe how Karoline Leavitt's statement impacted your life?" The transformation was immediate. Whoopi's voice trembled ever so slightly, a mix of pain and righteous indignation. She spoke of contracts canceled within days of the briefing, of online harassment, of fans who turned cold. "I've spent decades building my name," she said, looking directly at the jury, and with one flippant line at a podium, she cast me as dangerous, as extreme. She paused, voice cracking. "I've faced worse, sure. But this came from the White House." Her testimony was powerful, emotional, vulnerable, and filled with the kind of gravity that resonated with those who believed in legacy and public standing. Broderick presented evidence of brand withdrawals, lost speaking invitations, and a noticeable dip in The View's sponsorships following the controversy. Screens showed angry tweets, news headlines, even late-night jokes, framing Whoopi as a public pariah. The narrative was clear. Karoline's statement had hurt her not just professionally, but personally. In the audience, murmurs of sympathy rippled. On social media, support surged. "I Stand with Whoopi" began trending. Karoline listened without interruption, no folded arms, no eye rolls, just focus. She took notes while Whoopi spoke, her expression unreadable. She knew the emotional weight of Whoopi's testimony would sway some. It was designed to. But Karoline also knew the law didn't run on emotion. It ran on proof, precedent, and intent. Her prosecution ended, and when Broderick turned to the jury, delivering the final line, "She weaponized the podium of the presidency to hurt my client?" Karoline looked down briefly at her folder. Her rebuttal wasn't going to be flashy. It was going to be surgical. Because beneath the emotion lay holes, gaps she was ready to expose. But for now, Whoopi had landed the first blow, and it had struck deep. Karoline knew she couldn't win this case by playing defense. She had watched Whoopi's emotional testimony hit its mark, felt the tide shift in the room, and sensed the judge's gaze settle on her with premature judgment. But she wasn't finished. She was just getting started. When Judge Whitmore allowed a brief recess, she took the opportunity to review her outline one last time. What she was about to do wasn't just risky, it was a gamble that could redefine the trial. When the court resumed, Karoline stood tall. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, "before proceeding, I request to submit critical audio evidence relevant to this trial's impartiality." Whitmore leaned forward, brow furrowing. "We're not turning this courtroom into a radio show, Miss Leavitt." She didn't flinch. "The recording pertains directly to your conduct and legal impartiality under Section 455 of the Federal Judicial Code." Then, with measured precision, she pressed play on her phone. The courtroom fell silent as her recorded conversation from earlier that week echoed through the chamber. Whitmore's own voice, unmistakable, captured in casual derision. Is she here with a lawyer's confidence, or just a young girl playing dress-up in court? Gasps erupted from the gallery. Whoopi's legal team froze. The reporters in the back instinctively grabbed their pens. The judge's face turned pale. Karoline stopped the audio and looked directly at Whitmore. "That statement, made by you, Your Honor, while this case was pending, demonstrates clear prejudgment based on my age, gender, and position. It compromises the integrity of these proceedings." The room was electric. Tension, disbelief, and awe rippling across every row. A reporter whispered, "She just flipped the whole case." Whitmore slammed his gavel. "Ms. Leavitt, this is outrageous," he barked. But the words rang hollow. Everyone had heard it, and the federal code was clear. Judges must disqualify themselves when impartiality is reasonably questioned. Karoline didn't blink. "I'm not here to perform," she replied calmly. "I'm here to defend my name and demand a fair trial." Whoopi's lawyer Broderick rose, trying to object, but for the first time, he didn't sound in control. The judge's authority, once unquestioned, now stood on shaky ground. Karoline pressed forward, citing precedent, pointing to her legal right to self-representation, and reminding the court of the fundamental principle at stake: due process. Whitmore, visibly shaken, looked around the courtroom, at the journalists documenting every reaction, at the murmuring spectators, and finally at his own clerk, who would soon be obligated to report this moment to the Judicial Review Board. With no exit left, he relented. "This court is adjourned for recess," he muttered, rising abruptly. "I will confer with the Judicial Council." His robe billowed as he exited, but it was no longer a symbol of control. It was retreat. Karoline sat back down, slowly, deliberately. She hadn't just defended herself. She had exposed the flaw at the core of the trial, and for the first time since the lawsuit had begun, the power dynamic had shifted, not with shouting, not with tears, but with proof, strategy, and a single devastating recording. As the room buzzed with energy, one reporter leaned toward another and said what many were thinking: she didn't just fight back. She turned the judge into the story. The next morning, the courthouse steps were no longer just a place of passage. They were a media battlefield. News vans lined the street, reporters huddled under umbrellas, braving the early drizzle to catch what many now called the biggest courtroom twist of the year. Inside, the buzz was louder than any gavel. Judge Samuel Whitmore did not return to the bench. Instead, a court officer entered and solemnly announced, By order of the Judicial Council, Judge Whitmore has recused himself. This case will proceed under Judge Leah Morales. The gallery erupted. The cameras clicked. Karoline sat quietly at the defense table, her hands folded, eyes forward, showing no visible reaction. But inside, she felt a tectonic shift. She had done what few thought possible. She had unseated a sitting federal judge in real time. Judge Morales entered minutes later, composed and respected, known for her meticulous fairness. Her very presence calmed the room. "Let's proceed with clarity and impartiality," she said, her tone free of theatrics. For the first time, Karoline sensed she wasn't walking uphill against a storm. The field had leveled. Outside, the internet reacted just as swiftly. Viral headlines blared. Leavitt exposes bias, forces recusal, and young press secretary outmaneuvers veteran judge. On talk radio and across YouTube channels, men of a certain generation, former veterans, retired lawyers, everyday working-class Americans, spoke with admiration. "She stood her ground," one host said, "and didn't back down when the system tried to bury her." Back in the courtroom, Karoline took a breath. The game had changed, not just for her, but for how Americans viewed justice under pressure. She hadn't just earned her seat at the table, she had built it from scratch, and made the system sit up and take notice. With Judge Leah Morales now presiding, the courtroom felt transformed, less like a stage, more like a sanctuary for facts. Her voice was calm, deliberate, and firm as she called the session back into order. "We will resume with final arguments and submission of evidence," she declared, scanning both tables with equal scrutiny. Karoline Leavitt stood, this time not as a lone underdog under fire, but as a prepared legal mind finally given a fair arena. She walked to the center of the room with a calm precision that turned heads. Not flashy, not dramatic, but exacting. "Your Honor, today I present the full transcript and video recording of the White House briefing in question," she began, lifting a sealed folder and a USB drive. "The plaintiff has claimed I defamed her. These documents prove otherwise." Morales nodded for her to proceed. Karoline handed over the materials. On screen, the video played. Her original statement about extremist daytime television shows receiving federal funding. Not once did she mention The View. Not once did she utter Whoopi Goldberg's name. This wasn't a personal attack, she explained to the court. It was a policy critique, one grounded in budget priorities, not personalities. She pointed to the three witnesses she had brought, two veteran political journalists and a former White House aide, each of whom affirmed under oath that Karoline's comments were general, not targeted. Then came her second line of attack, the claim of financial harm. Karoline submitted Nielsen ratings data, ad revenue charts, and media trends for The View dating back 12 months. Her argument was clear. The decline began well before the briefing. Correlation, she stated, is not causation. The plaintiff's narrative is emotionally compelling, but legally unfounded. Broderick attempted to counter by referencing angry viewer tweets and blog articles, but Morales raised a hand. "Mr. Broderick, public opinion is not proof of malice. Do you have evidence Miss Leavitt intended harm?" He hesitated. "We believe the implication was intentional." "Belief," Morales replied, "is not evidence." Karoline pressed forward, citing New York Times versus Sullivan again. "The law is clear. Public officials are protected from defamation claims unless there is actual malice, knowledge of falsehood, or reckless disregard for the truth. The plaintiff has not shown either. And in fact, they haven't shown I said anything false at all." Her voice didn't rise. She didn't lean into drama. She simply laid the facts like stone upon stone, building a fortress of legal precedent. The courtroom was silent, but the energy had shifted. Even Whoopi, seated stiffly at the plaintiff's table, seemed to recognize that something had slipped. The certainty that had followed her for decades, on camera, on stage, was now facing a counterweight it hadn't expected. A young woman who knew the law as well as she knew herself. Judge Morales leaned back, reviewing the exhibits. "You may sit, Miss Leavitt," she said, her voice neutral, but with the faintest edge of respect. Karoline returned to her seat, her binder now half empty. She had made her case, not just to the judge, but to the country watching. Outside the courthouse, social media began to buzz again, but this time with a different tone. She outclassed them. What had started as a cultural clash was now a legal reckoning. The posturing was over. This was the trial in its truest form, and the weight of justice was finally shifting toward the truth. When Judge Leah Morales returned to the bench after an intense hour of reviewing documents, testimony, and legal precedent, the room held its collective breath. Karoline Leavitt sat poised, fingers lightly resting on her binder, her expression unreadable. Whoopi Goldberg stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Miles Broderick shuffled his papers, but didn't look up. The silence was broken by Morales' steady voice. After thorough review, this court finds that the plaintiff has failed to prove actual malice under the New York Times v. Sullivan standard. Furthermore, the court finds no direct link between the defendant's statement and the financial damages claimed. She paused, allowing the weight of the words to settle. Accordingly, this case is dismissed. The gallery gasped. A murmur rippled through the room as reporters raced to tweet the outcome. Karoline closed her binder with a soft click, the corners of her mouth turning upward in a restrained but unmistakable smile. Whoopi sat motionless, her eyes narrowing as if trying to process a blow she hadn't prepared for. Broderick leaned toward her, whispering something, but she didn't respond. Judge Morales added one final note: "I will also submit a formal report on the conduct of the initial proceedings, particularly regarding judicial bias, to the appropriate oversight committee." With that, the gavel fell, not just on the case, but on a saga that had become a national conversation. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was immediate and electric. Crowds gathered, reporters shouted questions. "Miss Leavitt, how does it feel to win? Do you feel vindicated?" Karoline answered only once, with the same quiet conviction that had carried her through the fire. "I didn't come here to win, I came to tell the truth." That single line exploded online, quoted, clipped, shared by veterans, law students, journalists, and free speech advocates alike. At the White House, the tone was celebratory. President Trump called her directly. "You didn't just defend yourself. You defended the principle." Meanwhile, pundits debated the broader implications, some praising her for standing tall, others criticizing the cultural impact. But one fact was undeniable. Karoline Leavitt had walked into a courtroom alone and walked out a symbol. Not of politics, not of spectacle, but of quiet strength in the face of overwhelming odds. And as the courthouse doors swung closed behind her, the echo of her footsteps was joined by a new sound: applause. Not just from her supporters, but from those who, whether they agreed with her or not, couldn't deny what she had just done. The courtroom victory hadn't dulled Karoline Leavitt's fire, it sharpened it. As the headlines shifted from verdict to aftermath, she found herself flooded with messages from lawyers, veterans, students, and even a few retired judges. But one message stood out. A handwritten letter from a man in Ohio. "I spent 32 years behind the bench. I never thought I'd learn something from someone your age, but you reminded me why I started." That letter didn't feel like praise, it felt like a responsibility. Within days of the trial's end, Karoline convened a closed-door meeting at the White House with senior legal advisors, ethics scholars, and Judiciary Committee staffers. Her goal was clear: to introduce sweeping reform aimed at addressing judicial bias and restoring public trust in the courts. "What happened to me," she said, "isn't unique. I just had a microphone loud enough to push back. But how many people don't?" Some in the room hesitated. The reforms she proposed? Mandatory bias training for federal judges, anonymous reporting channels for courtroom misconduct, and an independent review board for repeat offenders, were aggressive, bold, controversial. "You're asking to poke the judiciary in the ribs," one advisor warned. Karoline nodded. "If they don't like the poke, they should clean up the bench." Backed by growing public support, her proposals quickly took shape. What began as a few drafted policies turned into a White House initiative: Judicial Integrity and Accountability Reform, JI. Her team reached out to law schools, bar associations, and ethics councils to begin developing training modules and oversight frameworks. But the most unexpected ally came from the very courtroom she'd once stood trembling in: former Judge Samuel Whitmore. After recusing himself and facing inquiry from the Judicial Oversight Board, Whitmore requested to speak privately with Karoline. Many advised against it. She agreed anyway. Their meeting, behind closed doors in a small federal conference room, was quiet but intense. He admitted his failure. "I let my view of you color my conduct. That was wrong. I see that now." Karoline didn't gloat. She didn't lecture. Instead, she invited him to help, on her terms. Weeks later, Whitmore stood beside her at the launch of the first national bias training session for federal judges, held in Chicago. "I'm not proud of how I got here," he told a roomful of black robes, "but I'm here to make sure none of you end up in the same seat I did." The room was silent, then a few clapped, then more. The media, once skeptical, now followed Karoline's every move. Even critics acknowledged the scale of what she was building. She wasn't just the girl who beat Whoopi Goldberg, she was shaping the future of American law. In interviews, she was candid. "The law is only as fair as the people who enforce it. If we ignore bias, we undermine the Constitution we swear to protect." Universities invited her to speak. The American Bar Association began integrating JR guidelines into continuing education, and slowly what started as a courtroom clash had ignited a national reckoning. Karoline didn't see herself as a hero, just a citizen who refused to back down. The system, once used against her, was now being reshaped by her, and for the first time in decades, Americans from all walks of life began to believe something radical, that even the most entrenched institutions can change if someone brave enough demands they do. Night had fallen over Washington, D.C., casting long reflections across the marble walls of the West Wing. In her small White House office, Karoline Leavitt sat alone, the hum of city lights muffled by thick glass. On her desk lay two items side by side: the faded $1,000 0-cents contempt of court receipt from Judge Whitmore, and a handwritten letter from a Yale law student, pinned with a simple paperclip. The student's words were raw and honest. "Your case changed how I see justice. You gave us permission to believe it's still worth fighting for." Karoline traced the edge of the receipt with her fingertip, a quiet half-smile crossing her face. What once symbolized mockery now stood as a personal monument, a price paid not in shame but in resolve. The trial, the reform, the media frenzy, it was all a whirlwind she had somehow weathered without losing herself. But the truth she couldn't admit aloud was this: it had cost her more than anyone saw. She stood and moved to the window, gazing down at the Capitol. The city didn't sleep, neither did the weight of responsibility. She thought of Whitmore, of Whoopi, of the millions who had watched, judged, cheered, or dismissed her. And yet, in that quiet moment, it wasn't about them. It was about the girl who walked into a courtroom alone and walked out having forced the system to answer for itself. She hadn't just defended her own name, she had reminded a generation that silence is not the price of civility. Her phone buzzed. Another headline, another invitation to speak, but she let it ring. This fight had always been about more than cameras or clicks. It was about protecting the foundation so many assumed was unshakable. As she turned back to her desk, Karoline picked up the letter and pinned it to the wall beside the contempt fine. Different voices, same truth. She didn't need a statue or a medal, just a wall that told the story in its purest form: quiet, defiant, and enduring. The story of Karoline Leavitt teaches a powerful lesson about courage, principle, and the quiet strength of standing alone when it matters most. In a courtroom tilted against her, with a biased judge, a celebrity opponent, and public opinion stacked high, Karoline didn't crumble. She relied on facts, precedent, and the Constitution, not outrage or theatrics. Her victory wasn't just legal, it was symbolic. It reminded Americans that truth doesn't require power, only conviction. Her refusal to retreat in the face of cultural pressure showed that integrity and preparation can dismantle even the most entrenched systems of bias. But beyond the trial, Karoline's true impact came afterward, when she turned her personal battle into national reform. She didn't stop at winning. She worked to make sure no one else would have to fight the same battle alone. By demanding accountability from the judiciary and building new safeguards for fairness, She proved that real change doesn't come from a viral moment, it comes from what you do after the spotlight fades. Her story reminds us that justice must be fought for, that bias must be named, and that even the most underestimated voices can shake the walls of power if they refuse to be silenced.